It's only this verse, it's Kubrick's universe.
Open the podcast doors, Hal.
It's Kubrick's Universe, the Stanley Kubrick Podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in once again to Kubrick's Universe. We continue now with our special presentation of Nathan Abrams' event 2001 Beyond 50, which was held at Bangor University on June 16th, 2018, in commemoration of a half-century of Kubrick's masterpiece. In this, Part 4, we are super psyched to bring you a very cool panel discussion from those who actually worked on 2001. Yes, I'm not kidding. Like panelists, people who actually worked on it. You heard that right. I sang it horribly, but you heard it right. And these panelists include Ms. Joy Cuff, who actually built the moon sets just based on ideas by Kubrick, as well as designer David Peterson, stills photographer Keith Hampshire, makeup and special effects artist Colin Arthur, Kubrick assistant Tony Frewen, and Kubrick's brother-in-law and longtime producer Jan Harlan. So, the first panelist in this section is Joy Cuff. Joy Cuff trained in fine art at Kingston School of Art and has worked and is still working as a freelance artist, designer, and graphic designer from when she left Kingston in 1964. Her first commercial role was as a sculptor on the classic TV series Thunderbirds. Joy sculpted the puppet heads of the baddies in plasticine. But her most memorable project was working closely with Stanley Kubrick on 2001: A Space Odyssey, designing and constructing the moonscapes. While on the set of 2001, she met the matte painting artist Bob Cuff, who had been employed with special effects cameraman John Mackey to produce the iconic shot of the astronauts entering the pit on the moon where humans have discovered, or rediscovered, the inert monolith. These days, Joy remains a volunteer at the Kubrick Archive at the London College of Communication, which she's been doing for the past 11 years and counting. But who's counting?
I was working at MGM at the time. No, this is what I was going to MGM. I was working at Merton Park Studios, and I needed another job. And they on the list, I was in the union, so you look down the lists. And I've got a scrapbook here. And in my scrapbook, I've kept just bits, and I wrote to MGM because they wanted a model maker for landscapes, not moonscapes, landscapes. They said. So I wrote in about September. I don't have my copy because you didn't have things. You wrote it by hand, you know. And on Christmas Eve, I got the reply, and it said. I'll get my glasses out.
What year was that?
1965, Christmas 65.
20th December 65, having viewed your letter to John Hoseley.
John Hoseley.
John Hoseley.
Yeah.
Dated 21st of October.
Yep. Yeah, it's dated 21st of October. It appears conceivable that you may have an aptitude for animation, cell work, and or sculptural landscapes. Please contact me if you are desirous of this interview. And I've never forgotten the telephone number, which is Elstree 2000. That was the MGM number, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So I rang up, and then it took ages. They said, yes, all right, we'll give you an interview. And in the meantime, I went to work on Fahrenheit 451, which didn't take very long. But then the 18th of Feb, this letter is to confirm your engagement, because I went round and I said, yes, I'd like to do, I could do the modelling, because I did sculpture and painting, that's what I was. And I worked on Thunderbirds, but I'd already left Thunderbirds, so it wasn't as though I was poached, as some people say I was, but I wasn't. And my engagement commenced on Monday the 21st of February 1966, and your salary will be £16 per week. And my dad went, what? £16 a week was a fortune. But it's only for 2 weeks, because you had to prove, didn't you, that you could actually do the job. Because nobody built the moon sets before, and it turned out it was moon sets. And then I started the following week. Monday morning arrived. You start at 8 o'clock and you work right through till 6. And I met Stanley also. He always met, didn't he, everybody that worked for him. And he came through the door onto the stage, and there were the big stages. I was on 5.
Yes.
5, and that's right. And the wheel was on 6, wasn't it? And not one person came through. And of course, in those days, you don't have masses of photographs of people everywhere, all on television and Instagram and whatever, Facebook, and you know exactly what people look like. And I wasn't quite sure, because 3 people walked in, all American, all the same size, all practically the same age, and all wearing navy blue, dressed basically the same, kind of casually. But the one in the middle was Stanley, because he put his hand out first and said, hi. So that's how I met him. And I can't remember what the conversation was, because you're a bit kind of, it's your first day of a new job, and you wanted to impress, so that was it. And I worked alongside somebody called, well, I won't tell you his name, because I don't think he's probably around now. He's probably very old, the guy I first came. And I want to say something about it, because it was rather funny, because he didn't like, lots of old blokes don't like females coming along and working alongside them, especially in 1966. And this day, we dusted down the set, and Wally Beavers, who was the director who worked out of Shepperton, he said the other guy had gone for a dental appointment, and Wally Beavers said to me, I want this set ready by 2 o'clock, because we must come and film, you see, the movie. So I did. I worked through the morning, worked through my dinner hour, like you do. I mean, I've always done things like that anyway, and it was all ready. And then along comes John, and he says, what are you trying to do? Work yourself out of a job? I don't know whether he meant you're not going to do that on my watch, or the old-fashioned way that if you work too quickly, you're going to work yourself out of a job, which I thought was a very strange attitude for somebody. I don't think he really knew what the film industry was all about. Do you remember him?
I do.
Yeah. Anyway.
Very well. Very well, John Huxley.
Yeah. John Rose.
John Rose.
No, not the art director. No, the guy who was there. He was an illustrator. He was a very good illustrator.
Absolutely.
And he was a bit out of his depth doing 3-dimensional. But anyway, that was my first week. And then a couple of weeks later, Bob Cuff came in, who was an amazing matte artist, and he worked out of Shepperton with John Mackey, and he'd worked there since the early 50s under Wally Beavers. And he came along to build the iconic shot of the pit, which had been shot, the live action had been shot at Shepperton just before Christmas. Because H stage at Shepperton is the biggest stage in Europe, and that's how they got the space to kind of do it, all this around. And I learned the craft of split screen matte painting, matte models, whatever you want to call it. And from him then, it was very good to do it, because what we did, how he did it, and how Stanley wanted it done, because he was a stickler for everything had to be really good quality. It was kept in the film. The live action from Shepperton Studios was shot and kept in the film, in the can. So it wasn't developed. It was exposed.
It wasn't printed.
No, it wasn't printed. And what developed? Yes, developed. And what they do when they're shooting something which is going to have a model around the outside, because it was a model, when they're shooting, they have a matte box on the front of the camera, and these actually are 65mm cameras. I've actually got 65mm film here and 35, because 65 is about, well, obviously it's 65 millimetres, isn't it? And they're big, and the cameras are huge. You have to make sure the camera is absolutely steady, and you have steady tests. You know, you have a graph in front of it, and you run the camera and make sure it doesn't have any jiggle on it, and you do the steady test on both things, the model and the live action. Anyway, the live action is done, kept in the cold, put it in the fridge or whatever, and then we were doing the model, which then was shot on a Sunday, so that nothing else in the studios was being shot, so there was no... and also for the lights, any of the lights, you know, dimmed or whatever. Anyway, and it was 10 minutes in rushes. So if 24 frames a second is the live action, and a matte camera runs at 2 frames a second, I worked it out that it would be, because I can't remember how long we actually, because by the time you set it up and you do dip tests and you make sure that the exposure's right on both the model and the live action, it's over 2 hours of shot that it takes you. 10 minutes takes over 2 hours, just over 2 hours to do. I was talking about the that's right. You have to put you mat out the bit on the live action that you're going to have the model. And then when you do the model, you do the same thing on the front of you have a matte box which has the black little bit, which is then the live action. And there's the bit round the side is the crucial join. And that's why you have to kind of, if you're going to do it with original film, it's easier when you dupe it, because you can just see it, you know, and then paint it around. But you have what you call dip tests. So somebody rushes off to the dark room and just takes about 2 feet of film, and then you can see whether it's white or black, whether you have to fill it in or take it away. And it worked. And the awful thing is when you finish, you know, you open the gate and make sure that there's no hair in the gate, or it hasn't been a camera jam, but it all worked fine. And we went to Rushes the next day, and it was pretty spectacular. It's really lovely when you see something working like that. You know, you've seen all the bits all joined together. But that's basically my introduction, which is quite spectacular.
Next, we're going to hear from David Peterson. David Peterson got his start at the Newport College of Art, but then moved on to London University in 1965. And in 1966, he was recruited to work on 2001: A Space Odyssey. After that, he moved on to multiple different jobs, including artistic director and artist-in-residence for many different projects around Wales in the United Kingdom, including being the chairman and founding member of the Association of Artists and Designers in Wales. He also went on to start up his own art, craft, and design business in 1982 called Myfyrfa Peterson Productions. Gosh, I hope I didn't butcher that. I think I did. Myfyrfa, Myfyrfa. Myfyrfa Peterson Productions. At any rate, in more recent years, Mr. Peterson has been a guest speaker and a consultant for numerous associations and events. We're going to hear from him now.
You've got my first letter of confirmation up there, and my salary was £25 a week.
I'll tell you why. That's because you're a male. It absolutely.
Mine was 14. The winner.
Should we change the subject?
No, because all the blokes that worked after, well, even for me, somebody came in after me, he got twice what I got.
Should we go back?
Well, yeah, I was riding on a bus I just finished college and university, and I needed a job. And I thought, well, I go and offer my services to Henry Moore, the sculptor. And I was on a bus and I was reading a paper, I think it was the Telegraph, and in the adverts it said sculptors wanted, apply Hawke Films, Boreham Wood. So I actually got off the bus and I was with a friend and we went up to the reception, and the reception said, have you got a union card, an ATTI?
ACTT.
And I said no. And I said, don't say that in the advert. So what have you come for? And I showed him the advert, and he rang up and he said, there's a bloke at the door here. Anyway, somebody came down with a clipboard and said, can you work with plastic? Can you work with wood? Can you work with perspex? I'd never heard of perspex. Yes. When can you start? I said, well, we can start now. Well, turn up tomorrow. And we turned up, and that's how I got the job. And I have to tell you that it really inspired. I don't think any of us were aware that it was going to be such an incredible film. I certainly wasn't. I'd never had experience of filmmaking. But it inspired me to get involved with props, model making. I've been a sculptor all my life, and I've made over 80 films. And it comes from that moment when the guy said, okay, you got the job. I think they'd run out of model makers, hadn't they? Or they just couldn't get enough because, there were so many having to work there. And it was quite extraordinary that the experience that I got there. I worked nights. Whilst on the set, we had The Dirty Dozen with Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood. And somebody knocked on the door, can you make 24 hand grenades by tonight? That looked like hand grenades, etc., etc. And they were shooting Casino Royale as well. I seem to remember having coffee with Geraldine Chaplin, which left a big impression on me. Anyway, that's how I got into it, and it was not so much an accident. If it was an accident, it was a very happy one.
Next up, we're going to hear from Keith Hampshire. Keith Hampshire is a stills photographer. He spent over 2 years working alongside Kubrick on 2001, helping him on many special visual effects, all of which still stand up to today's modern CGI. He has since worked on a wide range of films, including, but not limited to, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith from 2005, The Mummy from 1999, and GoldenEye from 1995, which is my favorite Pierce Brosnan as James Bond film, so sue me. In all seriousness, he was, in 2013, the European Vice President of the Society of Motion Picture Still Photographers, but he still continues to embrace new technology and was one of the first unit photographers to adapt to the digital age, which we all now take for granted. He's gone on to develop his own company that produces 360-degree virtual movie sets. Here's Mr. Hampshire now, speaking about his experience as a still photographer on 2001.
I suppose it's my turn now. First of all,
We could skip you.
Yeah, please. Yeah, I have had a checkered career up until the point of 2001, which I won't go into, but I was a child actor. During that time, I met a photographer called Johnny J. And Johnny J was the actual stills photographer during the making of 2001, during the main production. And I was out of work and I was walking along Oxford Street, thinking, well, I've got to have a job by the time I get to the end of Oxford Street, otherwise I might go and throw myself under a train. And I was sort of a bit like that. I was very depressed. Anyway, John phoned and he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm not doing anything at the moment. And he knew that I was gone into the 60s scene as an assistant to various photographers in London. So he knew I was sort of trained in that. And he said, well, I'm doing this little job at MGM. I said, oh, really? What's that? He said, oh, well, are you interested? I said, yeah, I'd love to. He said, well, it's a little project called 2001, A Space Odyssey. before the phone was down, I was at MGM. And I was assisting John for a few months, and then main unit finished. John, one of the stories which is really actually quite amusing is that on the set of 2001, Stanley was always very, because of his interest in being, and his history of being a photographer for Look magazine and various other situations, he was always interested in the still photographers, and he loved still photography. So if you had a camera around your neck, no matter what he was doing, he'd come to you in mid-conversation and say, "What you got on there, 50? Or is it, what's the stop of that? What film are you using?" Forget all the actors and everything, he'd have a conversation. Well, this distraction actually was a bit too much. He didn't really want to hear sound clips or anything. It was before the days of having blimps. And a blimp is a thing, obviously, you have a camera in stop so you don't hear the click. And you can shoot pictures during sound takes and not hear. So they decided it'd be quite a good idea to build Johnny like a telephone box with AA glass, optical glass in the front. And the idea was Keith will look after you, John, and we'll put you in there and be there during the takes, and you can take the pictures. No one's going to hear you. And just not like that, and Keith will push you around and whatever. So we're on the stage, and Stanley has a reputation of doing a few more than 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of takes. And I was just there sort of twiddling my thumbs, and John was in his position inside this box taking pictures, I thought. And so I looked around, and the glass is totally all steamed up. Totally all steamed up. You couldn't see in there at all. And they'd cut, and I'd suddenly opened the door, and John went, I was so out of breath and everything. So said to Stanley, John really has a problem, he can't breathe, the time that he's in this box. So Stanley said, why don't we just fix an air cylinder on the top, and we'll feed him some fresh air in that way. So the next day on the set, this was all rigged up. John went in his box, I pushed it into the right position, turned the air on. What's that noise? It's Johnny breathing. So that was the end of that blimp. Anyway, that's just a nice little story. So during this sort of period of time, I was shooting large format photography. That was what I did. And we had some large plates to shoot on the pod bay and things like that. So I'd got this 5.4 Signer camera ready, and I was carrying it onto the stage. And Stanley was right behind me. And he said, what you got in there? And I said, 5.4 Signer. What are you going to do? I said, I'm going to shoot these Wally Vivas wants these 5.4 shots of the pod bay. So then I started to have good communication with Stanley. I really got on with him exceedingly well. And I was on that. After John left, I shot 10.8s and 5.4s of all the little spacecraft, the Orion and the Moon Bus, and all those space stations and things, and Discovery. And I shot them. They were quite difficult because the Discovery, for example, was, I don't know how long it was. Do you remember how long Discovery was?
30 meters.
30 meters long. And I had to shoot a 10.8 of that. And Stanley wanted it lit just with one light. There's only one sun. There's only one light. So in all the pictures that you see, everything is lit just with one light. And there is no way to get any fill. He didn't want any fill. He wanted it all to be natural. And that caused huge problems because you still needed to see in the shadow areas and things. And this meant going through the process of trying to find combinations of different films and different processes where you could get the maximum benefit of trying to get something in those shadow details. And I've got books at home of all the experiments I did of all the different types of films. When I was starting to do all this photography for Stanley, and he put me in that position, I then had 3 dark rooms, and at one stage I had 4 people working for me. Now I was like, I started, I was 19 years old. At this stage I was about 20 years old, and this was a union situation in those days, and you could never work in the industry unless you had a union ticket, and you couldn't have a union ticket unless you'd worked in the industry. So it's a catch-22, and most people who got on the industry got in the industry through a post room or through a process like that. So there was never any proper way of getting in the industry. And it was my job. I was resented by the outside a lot. There was a proper lab at MGM, stills lab, and there were a lot of problems there of me having my own laboratory and people working for me. And some of the people working for me had actually already worked for a stills for Brain Studios in the lab there. And this little 19, 20-year-old upstart was interviewing people who were printing professionals and working in the studios. And, this all got back to the unions. It became a little bit of a problem. But anyway, Stanley managed to solve that and sort that out. But going back to photographing all these little objects and all the tests that I did in the labs, I found that with a 10-8 camera, we had a whole stage where all these models were, and you had the one light, which was invariably something like a 10K, which was as far back in the corner of the stage as I could get it. So the light would carry it that far, so you wouldn't have any grading of the light. And then I used to shut the stage up and then just walk away for the weekend, because my stop was like 132 on a 10-8 camera. And I'd done all the movements that I could to carry on the depth of focus, but I still didn't know whether it sort of worked. But it did all prove to work out quite well. But one of the films that became amazingly successful, of all the ones that I tested, was, funnily enough, a Polaroid film. And at the stage, Polaroid had just brought out a film called PN55. And it was a Polaroid film with a negative. And I found that film the grade of that film was far superior to 10-8. So I was able then to start shooting 5.4. And I'd carry much greater depth of focus because I'm shooting in a smaller format. And, it became a little bit better. But the great thing about that film, it was the gradation on it, the gamma on it was so incredible that I found I was carrying shadow detail that had never sort of been able to be carried before. And Stanley was just over the moon about all of this. So the other thing that happened to me a little bit later on, because Stanley knew that I was a kid actor, and we were talking about Moonmaker and doing the sequence, and we were in the theatre one day, and Stanley said to me, "Gee, Keith, what do you do? Can you play an ape?" As one felt, "Yes, Stanley, of course, Stanley, I do." He said, "Keith, be an ape." And we were like in this theatre at MGM, and there's just Stanley and Ronnie Bear was there or something, or maybe Ray Lovejoy. So suddenly I'm confronted with this situation where I've got to be an ape. Well, I just made a mess of it or whatever like that. Anyway, there were lots of discussions about all of this and how they were going to film it. And this goes on to Stanley says, "Well, Keith, I think we'll start doing some prosthetics on you, making you as an ape." Oh, no. So now I've got to Stuart Freeborn, and I have face masks taken, and then I have embarrassing body masks taken, and then I'm told, "Your eyes are all wrong." "What do you mean your eyes are wrong?" "You've got to have contact lenses." "Okay. I know it's a great place. Go to Belgravia. There's this great eye specialist." So I go to this eye specialist in Belgravia, sit back in the chair. Now, you know Clockwork Orange, don't you? You've seen that. Right. Sit back in the chair. Sit back like that. So these things are put in your eye and they hold your eye wide open. You cannot move. Not at all. There's no anaesthetic. "What are you doing?" Saying, "We've got to make a cast of your eye." "What for?" "We've got to make these lenses." Okay. So, anyway, they put this funnel in, sitting back like that. And it's just like a funnel. And they start pouring this cold cream, and it starts coming down towards you. You start trying. It's terrifying, and then it sort of hits your eye, and it's really cold and horrible. And anyway, he's just sitting there, and you've got this funnel out like that. He can't blink or anything like that. Then he's got to get it out once it's set. So suddenly he goes, all right, we're going to get it out now. Okay. Pulls it out. You wonder where your eyeballs. Luckily it wasn't. So you think, great, okay, sit down. We've got to do the other one. The 2 eyes are different. So anyway, I have the two. So now it's showtime. So I go to the church. The body thing's been done. The mask's been done. The eyes are in. And we've got to reckon now what it's going to be like in South Africa, because it's all going to be photographed in South Africa. Okay, Stanley. So he says, what do you reckon it'll be like about 120 degrees in it? So I said, I'm sweating now, Tony. He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. Geordie was an electrician. He said, I'll get Geordie. Yeah. He said, I'll get Geordie to set up some 20 pairs on a run. There's going to be 420 Ks there and 420 Ks there. And you're to run up and down here for 20 minutes and see what it's like. The temperature was like 130 degrees. So I'm now the true guinea pig now, running up and down this catwalk and really getting light. Anyway, that's that sort of story. And then it transpired that Stanley decided either I was a better photographer than I was an actor, or he wanted me in the end to go out to South Africa to shoot all the Doorman plates. So I went out there, and I was out there for about 3 months under canvas in the Namib Desert. And it was the whole thing was the most incredible experience of my life. I mean, the thing about me, I fell in love twice on 2001. I fell in love with my wife, who I met, who's still with me, and with the film industry.
Our next panelist is Colin Hart Arthur, who was raised in the south of England and at the age of only 17 began an intensive 6-year course training in the fine art of sculpture, first at the Guildford School of Art and then followed by his final studies at the City and Guilds in London. Later, while working at Madame Tussauds Waxworks in London, he was invited to assist on 2001. This led to over 20 years of continuous occupation in the film industry worldwide, working in a wide variety of disciplines: makeup, set decoration, and special effects. Here's Mr. Arthur sharing his experiences working on 2001.
Where do I begin? I start with sculpture, and I kind of finish with sculpture. I was at art school in Guildford for about 4 years. I went on to the City and Guilds School of Art because in the early 60s, the wheels fell off Guildford Art School, and there was a student sit-in, and the course that I was doing just kind of stopped. So I went on to the City of Guilds School of Art in Kennington. I was very lucky with the professor that I had. He was a man called Michael Rosello, who used to do portraiture for Madame Tussauds, and he was my principal professor at Guildford Art School. We got on very well together, and we used to do moulding together. If the students would do a piece of work for a project for the school, but they didn't know how to do the moulding. And Michael Rosello is Italian, a trained opera singer, and in the evenings he'd say, "Come on, Colin, we've got to do some moulding," and he would sing arias while we were throwing plaster at clay sculptures to make the moulds of them. It was a process where you used to push brass shim, just stuffed brass about this thick, cut it into strips, and you put it into a clay model, into a form that when you've got the plaster on it, you can take it to pieces. You put soft soap on the inside and you fill it with plaster and open it. I went on to Kennington School of Art, and unbeknown to me, that Michael was talking with Madame Tussauds, the management of Madame Tussauds, because they were going to Bernard Tussaud, the great-grandson of Madame Tussaud. His children didn't want to carry on and be work in the Madame Tussauds workshops. So they wanted somebody to come in and take over from Bernard Tussaud. And Michael recommended me. I go up to Madame Tussauds. I was being paid £18 a month, not a week, £18 a month to work at Madame Tussauds. I was there for about 18 months, maybe a little bit more. And the film industry used to make contact with us. And because of the position I was in the management of the... Management not so much as a technician a sculptor, a young sculptor who knew modern materials. And so... sorry, I've gone blank for a moment. That's funny, unusual for me.
Start at the beginning.
What? Start again. So, working at Madame Tussauds, the film industry used to make contact with us. And in my position, I could actually cooperate with them. And we were doing various things with the BBC. I seem to remember doing early life casts of faces for the first Doctor Who. Can't even remember his name. And at one time, Stuart Freeborn, special effects makeup man, who, if you look in the internet and you see the films he's done, he should really have 6 or 7 Oscars to his name. He's an absolutely amazing man. He made contact with Madame Tussauds because he was realizing that Stanley needed 32 monkey suits, and there weren't enough technicians of even approaching the kind of skills in the makeup department, and unions insisted that makeup department would do everything to do with a mask, and they didn't have the skills. So he comes to Madame Tussauds and said, "You do life casts?" Well, sometimes we used to take life casts of hands, but I kept mum. And in the different conversations, after the principal photography, there was a kind of lull in the makeup department, in that Stuart realised that he was going to have to prepare for the monkey sequence, and he had enough time to come to Madame Tussauds, chat with me, and then I took him down to my parents' studio in Guildford in Surrey. And one way or another, my mum got involved sculpting the first visual for an ape mask. We've got a drawing somewhere of it, or we don't know whether we've got a photograph of it here. And during various conversations, Stuart said, "Well, would you like to come and help us do some life casting?" And the story about an outsider being able to go and work for MGM Studio is a rather amusing one. Years before, another famous special effects makeup man called Charlie Parker had a laboratory there, and in actual fact, the laboratory was where we did the live casting of you. And he was a guy who was always working on location, and his makeup chair, or for doing special effects makeup, was a collapsible dentist chair from the military, so it was made in aluminium. So he was doing a clear out of his workshop, and there was kind of mobile skips on wheels that you could have in MGM Studios, and there was tons of molds that he was throwing out, and plasterers union guy comes up, what's all this plaster? What's all this plaster? And they heard that Charlie Parker was going to make a life cast of an actor. So, we've got to do that. Well, there was a laboratory man helping Charlie Parker. Charlie was there, and they said, all right, come and do a life cast. And he made all various technical orders for molds for teeth and molds for the head. And the artist is there. Charlie's calming the artist down and said, well, no problems. These gentlemen are going to do your life cast. And what happened was that 2 plasterers' labourers come in, a carpenter and a carpenter's labourer with a length of 6x4 timber and a roll of rope. And they take the dental chair, and in front of the artist, pieces, well, because you did the same kind of thing, they saw the piece of timber, and they put the timber upright here, tied on the chair with a rope, and across. And Stanley says, not Stanley, Charlie says, well, to his assistant, I'm going down to the bar, you give me a ring when this is done. So in front of the poor artist, there's buckets and spades and shovels that look like something for the beach. And as he goes out, the artist is there with his arms with a beam through the back, like that. And he's like that. Well, they went through a plaster moulding process. There's been so many accidents. You hear about them, so many accidents in plasterers. And the principal sculptor for Ray Harryhausen, whom a lot of you probably have heard the name, the principal sculptor who knows about making molds, allowed a plasterer to make a mold of her hand, couldn't open the mold, and she lost her finger because the plaster heated up so much and it ripped her finger off. And there's been many other cases. Well, anyway, they start the process of making the mold, not adequate separation at the back. If you let plaster get very thick, it gets very hot. There's a trick. You can work with plaster. If some modern moulding materials weren't available, you can do things in plaster. But anyway, the lab assistant says, Charlie, you better come up here. Well, what's the problem? What's the problem? The actor, the mould's on him, and it's got some kind of separation here. I don't know what they used. And the whole thing's getting very hot. And the artist has got up with the chair attached. And he's moving around like this, smashing the laboratory to pieces, because all in the walls of the laboratory there were cupboards with gelatine, all of the things for making blood and things like that. And Charlie comes in the door and finds this situation. It calms the actor down, and the trick then is to take a chisel, a nice thick blunt chisel, and have the confidence to put it like that and hit it very hard with a hammer.
That explains a lot.
Well, no, that's it. And pop, the thing goes open. And from then on, a plasterer in MGM was never allowed to touch an artist. So now Stuart has the situation where he can't use the plasterers department. And so he's looking around for people to make molds, and he came to Madame Tussauds. And it goes on from there. Well, thank goodness for that accident in the plaster department. I ended up on 8 weeks sabbatical leave from Madame Tussauds, and 20 months later, I was using the same plastics that we used to make the masks. Put a mask on Keith, use the same plastics for making flying models for the Battle of Britain, 400 flying models, and then on in the film industry. Thank you, Stanley, for having such a fantastic project, and to Stuart and Charlie, who helped get me into the industry.
Next up is Tony Frewen. Tony Frewen is a writer, but he was also personal assistant to Stanley Kubrick from 1965 to 1968. all throughout the production of 2001, A Space Odyssey. And then Mr. Frewen rejoined Kubrick as his personal assistant from 1979 until Kubrick's passing in 1999. These days, Mr. Frewen represents the Stanley Kubrick estate. He's also been the writer of the 2005 film Color Me Kubrick, as well as the documentary What Is Out There, which was a segment on the Blu-ray release of 2001 back in 2007. And he's also been the associate producer of the indispensable documentary Stanley Kubrick, A Life in Pictures.
I'd like to say a few brief words about how I met Stanley. There are also sort of illustrative of what Keith was saying. But one small footnote. You should have mentioned Charles Parker did the makeup and a lot of the special effects on John Huston's Moby Dick that was made out of boron wood. Has anyone here ever seen the Huston Moby Dick?
Yeah.
I mean, it's the best Moby Dick. I mean, it's a wonderful bit of filmmaking. But it was all made out of boron wood, and there was some location work in Ireland and Wales. Well, anyway, back in the early 60s, I and my friends tended only to go and see foreign language films. You know, this was the era of Fellini, Bergman, Buñuel, the French Nouvelle Vague, and so on. And we didn't go to see English language films. You know, it was all sort of Coast Eisenhower, Doris Day, Rock Hudson, all that sort of shite. And I mean, it was really pretty awful. My father had worked in the film industry, I hated all the films he worked on, you know, dreadful films, you know. Moby Dick, Dam Busters, Scorpion Scoundrels, I thought, you know, what rubbish films. And it was only a long time later that I sort of appreciated just what they were, how good they were. Anyway, he had sort of worked his way up in the film industry and was sort of head of, I think, studio management. It was called MGM Studios. Well, the top dog at MGM Studios was a guy called Kim Hernes, who believed that a film studio, or any corporate entity for that matter, should be run like an army barracks. You know, and this was reflected in the union setup of the film industry. The men were in something called NACI, which is the National Association of Theatrical and Kinematograph Employees, and the officer class were in the ACTT. I cannot for the life of me remember what that stands for. There was a sort of third minor union, the ETU. Anyone? Anyone ever heard of the ETU? The guy up in the top left-hand corner has heard of it. ETU, I mean, it sounds like something out of Stalinist Russia, doesn't it? You know, I mean, knock at your door at 5 o'clock in the morning. So anyway, there was this really rigid class thing in the British film industry. You know, men against officers, and you know, the ETUs screwing about in the background. Well, Stanley came into MGM Studios as what was known as a renter. Though MGM were financing the film, he was what was known as a renter. You know, he was going to go in and purchase facilities of the studio. And I've got to say, I mean, MGM was probably certainly the best film studios in England and probably one of the best in Europe. It was built in the late 30s, I mean, with no expense spared. And it was our late great friend, Brian Forbes, who decided to close it in the early 70s. And he kept it open. The other studio down the way that everybody thought was just an awful studio, that's ABPC, which has gone under all sorts of names. I mean, you can date somebody by how they refer to the studios. You know, I call it the ABPC, which is late 50s. I think, what is it now? It's
Elstree Studios.
Elstree Studios, Big Brother and all that sort of nonsense. And
It's a much smaller studio.
they sold off the back lot, and they sold off this, and they sold off that. So anyway, he was MGM. My father had a big argument with Kim Ernest and thought, screwing the job, and left MGM, but started back on Monday working as a kind of factotum for Stanley. This was about July of 1965. Anyway, my father said to me, listen, we're starting out the pre-production of this new film, and they need a runner on it, a gopher. And I thought, oh God, British film industry. And I said something crass like, well, if it was Jean-Luc Godard, I might be interested. And anyway, my father was on and on. I mean, come down and meet the guy, and they need a runner. And I, at that time, was working in an ice cream factory in Boreham Wood in the deep freeze. But there was promise of middle management. Well, the company went bust about 2 years after I left. Anyway, so my father went on and on, and I thought, oh Christ, in the end, the only way I'm going to get him off my back is to actually go down to the studio and go through all the motions of meeting this guy. I said to him one day, I said, who is this guy? What is the film? And he said, well, I'm not sure what the title is. There are several titles. But the director is a guy called Stanley Kubrick, which rang a bell, because in those days I was very active in the campaign for nuclear disarmament and the Committee 100. And this, funny enough, Dr. Strangelove was the one English language film we'd all gone to see. And there was a tremendous amount of anti-Americanism around at that time. America to us was, going back to what I said earlier, was, Eisenhower and Doris Day and, Senator Joe McCarthy. This was not a progressive country at all. Whereas we all listened to jazz, Charlie Parker, not the makeup artist, the outer saxophonist, and Dizzy Gillespie and people like that. And that was a kind of parallel, other realm of America. That had nothing to do with Eisenhower and Doris Day and Rock Hudson. And it rather surprised us and made us sort of think twice about our ideas about what America was. There was Lenny Bruce and this and that. But here was this really dark, yet funny film, Dr. Strangelove. That had taken, this greatest anxiety of the Cold War and made it funny. We got to see it a couple of times. As an aside, there were two criticisms of Dr. Strangelove when it came out that always amused Stanley, and one of them he could never quite understand. I forget the guy's name, but the American Film Institute in those days published a monthly film bulletin of reviews of the latest American cinema. And the guy whose name I've forgotten hated Dr. Strangelove. But he had a strange phrase that he concluded the review with. He said, and I quote, "This film is sight gags for perverts." And Stanley thought that would make a great title for a movie, with a certain guaranteed box office. But we could never understand what this guy meant. Well, perhaps there was a few sight gags, but where did the perverts come from? Perhaps a few years later it could have been named sight gags for preverts. You know that illusion? Now the other review, the doyen of American film critics in those days was Bosley Crowther on the New York Times, and he hated the film. I mean, he hated Stanley's films by and large. You know, in the same way that Time Out hated Stanley's films. Time Out never liked Stanley. And Stanley often used to say, you know, if you're writing a letter, particularly if you're criticising somebody or, you know, you're making a complaint, just ask yourself, what would you look like if this letter fell into the hands of Time Out? Be careful. Anyway, but Bosley Crowther hated the film, and his quote was, Moscow Gold couldn't buy better anti-American propaganda than this film, which to him was a bad thing, but if you think about it, it's a pretty good thing. I mean, for its criticism of the war machine in the States. Anyway, so the name Stanley Kubrick meant something to me, so I thought, oh, well, I'd go down there. My father drove me down on Sunday morning, and this was September 1965, a week after my 17th birthday. And he drove me down to MGM and dumped me in an office. There was a big boardroom table. And surrounding it were all these bookshelves, you know, the sort of thing that 50 years later you'd buy from IKEA, all around, and they were full of books. Books on subjects like cosmology, astronomy, UFOs, and great sections on surrealism, Dadaism, futuristic, fantastic art, and so on, you know, Giacometti and whatever. And I was looking, and I said, Jesus, you know, I wouldn't mind working here just to be able to read these books. And I took down from the shelf a book I'd only ever read about, Patrick Wahlberg's book on Max Ernst. It was always one of my favourites. And I thought, Jesus, you know, and I was sitting down at the desk reading this Max Ernst book, and, you know, all these wonderful fold-outs of Ernst's paintings. And this guy walked through the office and sort of looked at me and, in a rather dishevelled sort of sports jacket and baggy trousers and an old pair of shoes. And I thought, he sort of looked at me and I thought, who the fuck are you? I thought perhaps it was a cleaner or somebody. You know. And then we disappeared out, and he came back a few minutes later and I sort of tentatively put his hand out and he said, "Are you Eddie's son?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm Stanley." And he sat down opposite me on the table. And he said, "You're looking at the Max Ernst book?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "You know, I'm a big fan of Max Ernst." I mean, back in those days, I mean, surrealism and Dadaism you couldn't give away in this country. I mean, nobody was interested. You know, it was only with the rise of sort of pop art and the rediscovery of those two isms that they were sort of taken aboard and appreciated for what they were. So anyway, Stanley said to me, "Listen, you know, I'm making this film, and one of the problems I've got in it is coming up with ideas for futuristic or sort of science fiction, otherworldly landscapes." And he said, "You know, who should I be looking at? I mean, what artists?" Well, since I left school, you know, 2 years earlier, I mean, nobody had ever asked me anything, you know, not even the time, you know. And, you know, I felt terribly flattered, and I said, "Well, you know, apart from Max Ernst, you know, Europe After the Rain, Easter," and you know, I mentioned some other artists. And we got chatting, and we spoke about an hour and a half, here, there, and everywhere. So cosmology, did UFOs exist? I mean, what are the possibilities of extraterrestrial life and so on? And it was really quite something. And he said, "Well, listen, you know, Eddie's probably told you we need a runner on the picture. Would you like to come and work for us?" I said, "Sure." I said, "Well, when should I begin?" He said, "How about 7 o'clock tomorrow morning?" And I said, "You've got a deal." And I turned up at And I started off doing very rudimentary jobs. I always did rudimentary jobs. People often ask, what was the kind of hierarchy or structure working for Stanley? Well, to be honest, there wasn't. There was Stanley and the rest of us. Some people might have had certain specialities, but it was Stanley. There was no tiers of middle management. Stanley was in control of everything. And it wasn't always easy working for Stanley, but it was certainly always exhilarating, always challenging. And he had that sort of curiosity about the world that most people, get knocked out of them as kids. He was tremendously curious about this, that, and the other. And as Michael Hare says in his book, Stanley's mind was working so fast. Stanley had great difficulty keeping up with himself. And instead, I would recommend Michael Hare's book. Has anyone here read it? I know you would have read it. Well, you should read it. The next best thing to knowing Stanley is reading Michael's book. Now I'll just give you a couple of examples. Stanley was always very good. He said to me one day, this was about a week after I started work, he said, listen, somebody from MGM or wherever sent me the script to read. He said, I haven't got time to read it. Can you read it and type up a critique and synopsis and whatever? And I said, no, I can't, And why did I say no? Because A, I hadn't gone to university. B, I didn't sound posh like all those people on the third programme or Radio 3 as it subsequently discuss books. And it wasn't something I could do. You really had to be trained to this. He said, listen, hold on a second. He said, can you read? I said, yeah. It's a given, Squire. Can you read? Yeah. He said, well, when you've read something, if somebody said to you, what's this book or this screenplay about? Would you be able to tell them? And I said, yeah, of course. And he said, and if they then said to you, do you think this is a success? Does it succeed on its own terms? Is it good, bad, indifferent, whatever? And I said, well, of course. And he said, well, you can type, can't you? Which you know good. And I said, yeah. He said, well, what's the problem? And I had no answer to that. So I sat down and read the script, typed up, critique, synopsis and whatever. But it was a good example of Stanley having confidence and trust in people that they didn't have in themselves. And what Keith said about sort of being plucked from acting as John Jay, Winston, I think, was such an irritating guy.
Well, I can't.
And there you go. But he does think the same. So Stanley plucks Keith out, and suddenly, Keith's got a department, he's responsible for this, that, and the other, and he's doing things that he never thought he probably would. And Stanley was always very good at that. He could spot the face in the crowd and think, that's the guy who's got potential, and sort of pluck him out and overload him with responsibilities and jobs and the kind of thing, oh Christ, and then go ahead and do it. If you look at, Stanley came over, when was it, 1961 or whenever it was, to make Lolita. He gave stacks and stacks of people a break and encouraged stacks and stacks of people. And did a tremendous amount for the British film industry and for the people who worked in it. As I say, looking back on it, were it not for Stanley, I'm quite sure I can confidently say I'd now be in ice cream middle management. Or
Jan Harlan joined Stanley Kubrick in 1969, initially as producer on an intended feature film on the life of Napoleon Bonaparte, which had been a passion project of Stanley's for many years, but was ultimately, lamentably, abandoned. Mr. Harlan was later executive producer on all of Kubrick's films from Barry Lyndon onwards, and of course he worked with Stanley on many other unrealized projects in between. These days, Jan is a guest lecturer at many different film schools around the globe, and he often serves in juries at film competitions. He was principally involved in the formation of the Stanley Kubrick Archive at the University of the Arts in London, as well as his instrumental work in helping to create the large traveling exhibition on Stanley Kubrick, which continues to tour the world and has had well over 1 million visitors so far.
Well, I merely suggested some music on this film. I did not work on the film. I shouldn't be sitting on this panel. I lived in Zurich.
Off you go.
I lived in Zurich at the time, and I visited regularly Boreham Wood, and I saw the sets. And anyway, I was in touch privately with Stanley, and we talked about music, and I suggested some music, and that's it. Thank you.
Colin, I believe you have something in the box.
Oh, yes, forgotten about that. Okay, I'm supposed to. It's only been touched once in the last 40 years. This is an original skin from a mask from the 8s. Keith will tell you people got very, very hot in these suits. They got sweated into the masks, and we had a terrible problem of drying them out at night and sterilizing or just cleaning the whole thing. And I, like a mug, had an idea of using ozone. And the ozonators are put into public places to clean them up so they smell fresh in the mornings. But ozone is the absolute enemy of foam latex. So we had clean masks, but after 3 or 4 weeks, these masks would start to break up. So we used to have to take the skins off the mask and recover them, especially on the principal artists. So what you've got here is a 2001 8 mask. That's just the latex that goes over the mechanical mask. There is one like, this, say, never been touched, never been passed over, worked on, and that is an original skin.
Would you like this to go into the traveling exhibition on Stanley Kubrick?
Yes.
We have now 1.3 million visitors, and the exhibition goes next to Barcelona and next year to London at the London Design Museum. And this is a genuine article, so it could go into the exhibition.
Okay.
As a loan from you.
Yes, okay.
Is that a good idea?
Yes, sir.
Let's be in touch. Okay.
Right. So there you are. I'll bring it up closer to anybody who wants to.
You're a bit slow there, Colin.
Very cool. Hey, we're going to continue this presentation with one more installment of Nathan Abrams' event 2001 Beyond 50 in the next episode of Kubrick's Universe. Thanks once again to Nathan for allowing us to broadcast this special event and to all of the speakers in this episode. Once again, my deepest thanks to our producer and editor, Stephen Rigg, as well as our amazing research team, James Marinaccio and Mark Lentz.
It's Kubrick's Universe. We just live in it.
We have taken very thorough precautions in this podcast against broadcasting anything
which might only be attributed to human error.
Thank you for listening to the Stanley Kubrick podcast. Come back soon.